This week, the Disneyland Hotel project gets green lit. But with just 5 months until opening day, can they build the hotel in time? Walt Disney is racing against the clock. Construction is now 60% complete, or so they claim. But when you hear what's still missing, that number starts to sound more than a little optimistic. A deep dive into the Disneyland that never was and we never got, with long forgotten attractions, lost lands, and ambitious ideas that didn't make it past the drawing board. Brickey here, your ghost host for another episode of Old Disney News Tonight. We've made it through the 6th week of 1955, which means it's time for episode 6, covering the week of Monday, February 7th, 1955 through Sunday, February 13th, 1955. It's time for our weekly check-in on how Walt Disney is using television to build Disneyland, except this week, it looks like people didn't care as much as he thought they would. Oh, can I relate, Walt? This week in TV talk, Disneyland's TV show is getting serious industry attention with its first Emmy nominations. Disneyland, the TV show, is in the running for multiple Emmy awards, including Best Variety Series, Best Individual Program for Operation Undersea, the 7th episode, and even Outstanding New Personality for Walt himself. And here's a little bit of Hollywood irony. Walt's up against Fess Parker, who thinks the Disneyland TV show is rapidly becoming a household name as Davy Crockett. So, in a way, Walt was competing with his own creation. The winners will be announced on March 7th, so don't Google it. Come on, pinky swear with me, and stay tuned to Old Disney News Tonight to find out if Walt takes home his first Emmy. He already has so many Oscars. But the accolades don't stop there. The National Association for Better Radio and Television, which is just a terrible name, no wonder the organization doesn't exist anymore, awarded Disneyland Program of the Year for children's television. Friends, the show isn't even through its first season, and it's already getting nominated for awards and winning some. Now onto this week's episode of Disneyland, titled A Progress Report and Nature's Halfacre, which aired February 9th, 1955. This week, 70 years ago, for the first time, viewers got to see Disneyland under construction. Walt himself walked America through why he chose Anaheim and how the freeway system made it the most accessible spot in Southern California. And by the way, if you don't know this, the two guys that found the parcel of land, one guy's last name was Wood, and the other guy's first name was Buzz. So that's the original Buzz and Woody. You're welcome. So what people get to see are time-lapse cameras. You remember the ones we announced last week? They've obviously been there a lot longer than last week. So that means that article is just somebody discovered, hey, check it out. Walt put up a handful of cameras at his construction site. So you have to wonder, did the construction workers know that they were being filmed the entire time? Cameras had been rolling since groundbreaking, giving a fast motion view of the park being built from farmland to fantasy. So, did people freak out seeing Disneyland finally start to take shape? Absolutely not. No. Surprisingly, this episode didn't make waves. People didn't seem to react to seeing Disneyland 50% complete. This week, to make this episode of Old News Tonight, I researched over 200 articles written about Disneyland. Only one article would review Walt's episode. People didn't seem to care. It makes sense. If you have no idea what Walt is building and you've never been to a Disneyland before, why would you care seeing a dirt lot with a bunch of half-built structures and no rides? It doesn't scream magic. We, in 2025, we see this footage, we get excited because we know the final result. But back in 1955, no one knew what Disneyland was supposed to be yet. So when you strip away the context, all they saw was construction footage, something that they couldn't even imagine of what it was going to be. And looks like Walt learned a lesson that every YouTuber learns. It's hard to get people to care about construction footage. This would be the last major construction update on TV until July 13th, 1955. And I think this explains why this Disneyland progress report, something we would lose our minds about today, didn't click back then. Sadly, this is the last construction update. And the beginning of Disneyland the TV show, it was promised that they would take us on the journey. Well, Walt does it after 6 months and then doesn't do it again until right before the park would open. Do you remember last week when we talked about how Disneyland was stealing Dad's Boxing Night? Well, a furniture store created an ad in this week's paper and it confirms it. The article read, "Hey Dad, who wins in your house, Disneyland or the fights?" This was 1955, a time when most homes had only one TV set, if they had one at all. And now, thanks to Walt Disney, families were fighting over the remote, which I don't really think that they had remotes yet. To solve this, Woody's TV and Appliances suggested Dad should buy a second television set. Walt Disney wasn't just reshaping entertainment, he was changing the way families consumed media, the way they spent their time together, and even how many TVs they should own. This is how the legend of Disneyland was built before the park existed. Now friends, if you're enjoying old news tonight, good news. I have been enjoying it too. But let me tell you, this series is way more work than I bargained for. Digging up old newspaper articles, fact-checking, and connecting all the dots across 70 years, it's become a full-time detective job. If you want to help keep old news coming back every single week, consider becoming a Magic Brickey holder, aka YouTube channel member. And as a thank you, you'll get to watch along with me and the rest of the audience as we do a live reaction to this week's Disneyland TV episode. And speaking of progress, we've got a huge Disneyland construction update, including an official approval for the Disneyland Hotel. But can they actually build it in time? Let's jump in. Here on Old Disney News Tonight, we've been following the story of the Disneyland Hotel from its first announcement back in episode 3. And this week, we finally have an official update. The project has been approved. According to the Register on Tuesday, February 8th, the Anaheim Planning Commission approved 6 variance requests, including 2 by Disneyland Incorporated. The planner approved a petition by Disneyland Inc. for a $10 million hotel of 500 units to be located south of Cerritos Avenue between Walnut and West Street. The project will also include swimming pools, a cocktail lounge, a service station, several small shops, and a parking facility for 700 cars to serve visitors of the Disneyland Hotel. Now, if you're following along, you'll recognize details from episode 3, but one new element stands out. A service station at the Disneyland Hotel. When the hotel opened, there was a Richfield service station on property. They also, at the time, were the sponsors for Autopia. But I don't recall ever hearing it mentioned in earlier reports until now, so we just uncovered a new piece of the puzzle. Now onto the timeline. Eugene R. Lemon, Disneyland representative, hoped to have 200 units of the project completed by the time Disneyland opens June 15th, and to continue adding 100 units yearly until completion. The Disneyland opening date was targeted for July 15th, not June 15th, like it's stated in the article. The hotel? Yeah, that's not happening July 17th. The Disneyland Hotel wouldn't open until October 5th, 1955, and even then, when it did open, it only had 100 rooms at launch. The grand opening wouldn't be until 1956. And as for the planned 100 rooms per year until reaching 500 rooms, let's just say they underestimated Disneyland's success. The Disneyland Hotel, as we know it today, has 1,041 rooms, plus 344 rooms for the new DVC tower, 3 times their original plan. Disneyland Inc. also received an approval for a service station inside the 9,000 car Disneyland parking lot, subject to making a possible change in the location depending upon the traffic pattern in the area. All right, so this one has me scratching my head. I can't find any record of a Disneyland gas station inside of the parking lot. So my guess is this is actually referring to the backstage service station we spoke about last week that Disneyland would use for company vehicles. And to add to the growing list of errors in this article, he says that it would be 9,000 spaces, but everybody else has reported there would be 10,000 parking spaces. So I feel like this article might be a little loosey-goosey. But that's why I love putting this puzzle together with all of you every single week. We take the news straight from 1955, compare it to what actually happened, and find all the little twists along the way. So what's next? In the comments below, put in your date on when you think they'll say, actually, it's going to be October and not July. Subscribe now, or Disneyland might not open on time. I'm not saying we control history, but do you really want to take that risk? Speaking of risk, Disneyland is apparently 60% complete. which seems wildly optimistic considering they just added a second shift of workers and still need to build 40 different facades. Let's check in on this week's construction chaos with our This Week in Disneyland Construction with just a slight 70-year delay. By this point, in old Disney news, we're watching Disneyland take shape week by week. Each episode gives us a clearer picture of just how massive and chaotic this project really was. This week, the pressure is really starting to mount. For months, we've seen newspapers estimate Disneyland's construction budget at $7 million, then $9, then $10. But now, for the first time, we see the real number, $17 million, which is close to what they officially said they spent on building Walt's original Magic Kingdom. Walt Disney sold his dream to investors at around $5 million. Here we are, 5 months from opening day, and the costs have more than tripled. If Disneyland's financial situation was tight before, it's about to become an all-out scramble to get to the finish line. To top it off, the Long Beach Press Telegram decided to refer to Disneyland as a fun fair? Knowing what Disneyland would become, a fun fair sounds downright insulting. A fun fair is what you would build in a mall parking lot over a long weekend, not a brand new, fully immersive theme park. People didn't know what was coming. At this moment in time, that's how the world still sees Disneyland, a fancy carnival. The joke's on them though, because we know what's about to happen. Let's take a moment to zoom out and check in on Disneyland's overall progress. We are 5 months from opening. Grading and excavation are done, meaning all the dirt work is mostly finished. The waterways are complete, so the Rivers of America is more than a hole in the ground, and buildings are finally starting to go up and go vertical. But as of this week, only one major building is technically finished. That building is now the Disneyland Opera House. Attraction vehicles are being built at the Disney studio, including streetcars, stagecoaches, and Conestoga wagons, before their attractions even exist. They've got ride vehicles ready, but no tracks, no roads, no infrastructure, no building. It's pure faith that when all these elements are finished, they'll snap together in time. It's a crazy out-of-order way to build a theme park, but Walt was betting on every craftsman working in their specialty. If everyone built what they were best at, it would all magically come together in the end. What an insane creative gamble, and I love it. One of Walt's most controversial design decisions was taking shape this week at Disneyland. It's what we now refer to as the berm. This raised embankment that surrounds Disneyland was Walt's way of blocking out the outside world, so guests would feel fully immersed in his fantasy. But in 1955, no one in the amusement park industry thought this was a good idea. In fact, they warned him not to do it. They thought it was a waste of space and money, but Walt knew better. He didn't want guests to see gas stations, billboards, or the Anaheim sprawl. The berm wasn't just landscaping, it was protection for the magic. It's one of the best design decisions that Walt ever made. That one decision separating Disneyland from every other amusement park that came before it. Now, let's get down to the 60% complete, because after I give you these details, I think you'll agree with me. It sounds very generous. Another article this week claims that Disneyland is 60% complete, which feels extremely optimistic, because the very next line reveals that they just now added a second shift of workers to speed up the process. They're about to start construction on the facades, 40 buildings in 5 months. Good luck. That means up until now, most of Main Street Frontierland has been framework only. And we already know Disneyland is being built like a Hollywood set, where the exteriors look beautiful and the interiors are a little on the empty. That's a lot. I mean, a massive amount of work to do in 5 months, even with the lack of modern day red tape. Here's another fun discovery this week. The Opera House, the first completed building in Disneyland, was converted into a woodworking mill for Disneyland's architectural details. It's where they were crafting all the decorative pieces that make Disneyland's buildings feel charming and real. This includes the gingerbread trim, which I know sounds delicious, but in architecture, it refers to intricate wood detailing. And let's be real, if any place was actually going to construct an entire town out of gingerbread, Disneyland would be that place. So essentially, what they're doing in the mill is all of the fancy facade work, all of the detailing. It will be constructed at the mill, put on a flatbed, drove down Main Street or to a different land, and then that will be pinned up on the front of the building. And if you have an eagle eye and you go to Disneyland on a windy day when they're doing construction and take down the tarps, if you look at the buildings, you can see how the facades were tacked on. It's fascinating because you can witness how Disney's history is still alive. The most exciting update is that the Disneyland first locomotives have arrived. These are practically full-size steam trains built at a 5/8 scale, and imagine how exciting this must have been for Walt. A few years ago, he was building a tiny backyard train for his family and close friends, and now real steam locomotives were being delivered to his own little town that he could drive trains around. 2 trains were built, one for passengers, one for freight, even though people would actually ride both. More than a mile of track is about to be installed. In a few weeks, for the first time ever, something at Disneyland will be fully operational. Meanwhile, over at the Rivers of America, landscaping is in full swing. Some of the biggest trees are being planted this week, and they're personally selected by Walt Disney. That means even though my man is running one of Hollywood's biggest studios and overseeing every tiny detail of Disneyland's construction, he's also out there picking trees that he wants to appear in Frontierland. This is a level of obsession and detail that made Disneyland absolutely different. But friends, the clock is ticking. With each week, the insane scope of Disneyland's construction becomes clearer. And the more I study these stories, the more I appreciate how impossible this project was. They're building a city from scratch in less than 1 year. They've still got mountains of work to do, but the hardest part, no one in history had ever built a park like this before. There was no playbook, no blueprint, no one to emulate. They were inventing Disneyland as they went along, and in just 5 months, the world will finally see what they were building. To all of those first-time watchers, welcome to Old Disney News Tonight, where we dig up 70-year-old Disneyland news as if it just happened yesterday. And if you missed an episode, good news. I've got an entire Old News Tonight playlist where you can catch up on every story, every discovery, every strange newspaper mistake we've uncovered so far in every episode. But now, let's dive into this week's biggest what could have been, but never was. Because some of Disneyland's earliest plans were way more ambitious, bizarre, and just plain weirder than you could ever have imagined. February 1955 was an exciting time for Disneyland fans, though they didn't know it yet. Newspaper articles and official press releases pointed an ambitious vision of what Disneyland would be when it opened that summer, but not everything announced would make it past the drawing board. Some ideas evolved, some were quietly abandoned, and others were just plain wrong. Let's look at some of the most intriguing, ambitious, and incorrect Disneyland announcements from this week in 1955. Let's start off with the names that never stuck. Before Disneyland was a place you could visit, it was a place reporters had to describe, often incorrectly. Were they told it wrong? Did they hear it wrong? Who knows? But here are some of the wrong names I've gathered from just this week. True Life Adventureland. I think this was actually what Disney was going to go with. It's a mix-up between Adventureland and Disney's True Life Adventure documentary series. It's a great name for a National Geographic theme park, but not right for Disneyland. So I love that it's just Adventureland, not True Life Adventureland. Here's another one for you. Rivers of the World. Sounds like a poetic way to describe Rivers of America, right? Wrong. This was an early name for the Jungle Cruise. Rivers of the World, not nearly as strong as JC. River Island, a vague and grandiose name used to describe Rivers of America. Clearly, the press wasn't getting official clarification back then, or was Disney at this moment actually planning on calling it River Island? They keep referring to it as a 100-foot paddle boat, but they never mention the name Mark Twain. Now let's look at some attractions that never happened. Early press reports didn't just get names wrong, they also made some bold claims about attractions that would never exist, at least not in the way that they were described. But I have to think that a lot of these attractions are coming from Disney directly because we can kind of retrace them as early origins for things at Disneyland and other Disney theme parks. The squid and other animated animals will be included in the True Life Adventure division of Disneyland. Everybody keeps talking about this squid showing up at Disneyland, but here's the thing, it doesn't, not at least in the opening days. This one keeps popping up in early 1955 reports, but there were no plans for the giant squid to be part of Adventureland. The famous 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea squid wouldn't make its way to Disneyland until later when Tomorrowland needed something to fill its empty spaces. But I'm not sure the squid ever showed up because I think what they showed at the 2,000 Leagues Under the Sea exhibit at Tomorrowland was more the technical stuff, like pieces of the Nautilus and whatnot. Squid's not very futuristic unless they put Spaceman's helmet on him. That would be awesome. Are you ready for this description of Tomorrowland? Jet-propelled monorail coaches will whiz visitors over buildings of advanced architectural design. Sounds like an early version of the Disneyland monorail, except the real monorail wouldn't arrive until 1959. Either this was an ambitious idea that didn't make it into the original park, or the press was making things up. I like to think this came from Disney directly, and that he was already kicking around the idea of a monorail, but 4 years from now. Quote, a space terminal of the future. The adventurous-minded may board a passenger rocket and fly around the moon. This one is interesting because we did eventually get Rocket to the Moon as a opening day attraction that I don't think was actually open on opening day, but I've never heard it referred to as a space terminal before. It's possible that early plans for Tomorrowland included something more ambitious, more themed, or with a different storyline. Or maybe the reporter was adding a little sci-fi flair to his article. You ready for this one? Because this one would come to a Disney park just decades later and on the other side of the globe. Quote, an Alice in Wonderland walkthrough. Disneyland never got an Alice walkthrough. We did get an Alice in Wonderland dark ride in 1958. But no good idea at Disney truly ever dies, and Shanghai Disneyland would eventually get an Alice in Wonderland maze, just 61 years later after this article was published. But here, friends, this is my favorite one out of all of them. This is the one that I wish happened so much. The article quotes Paul Bunyan's longest little bar with the tallest glass of root beer will face a river dock where passengers may board a 100-foot paddle wheeler for a cruise around the rivers of America. The Paul Bunyan Bar never happened, but I wish it did. The idea of the longest bar evolved into the mile-long bar in Bear Country in Disneyland in 1972. But before that, Magic Kingdom had the original version, which later became part of Pecos Bill, Tall Tale Inn and Cafe in 1998. Some ideas reported in 1955 were technically accurate, but clearly were way more ambitious than what Disneyland could deliver. This is the one that will inspire its own standalone video. Because friends, this was the idea for the Rivers of America, and this one got me all juiced up. The excursion boat will pass replicas of colorful river towns, Natchez, Mobile, and other buildings of historical fame such as Mount Vernon and West Point. New Orleans did show up as New Orleans Square, but in 1966, not 1955. But Natchez, Mississippi, Mobile, Alabama, they never made it. And while we never got Mount Vernon or West Point, you could argue Liberty Square at Magic Kingdom took inspiration from those concepts, friends. There was a whole different plan for the Rivers of America. Even though we technically wouldn't get it the way they predicted it, the Magic Kingdom, a couple decades later, would get Walt's idea. Adventureland will have a Tahitian settlement where intrepid travelers may take an explorer's boat on a 5-acre voyage over tropical waters, passing ports of call in Mexico, Central America, South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. A 5-acre boat voyage sounds like an early version of the Jungle Cruise before budget reality set in. But friends, we never went to all those places. There were no settlements, just animals from some locations. The final ride still takes guests through multiple continents, but on a much, much smaller scale than predicted here. Disney calls this early stage of creative development blue sky phase, when ideas can be ambitious, ridiculous, or impractical, but nothing has been cut down by budgets, time, or physics yet. And as someone who's worked in the creative industry for decades, I completely understand this process, and I do it myself. Big ideas always start as just that. They start out big, and then reality kicks in. But rather than seeing these as failures, I see them as necessary corrections. Honestly, I would still love to order one of those tallest root beers from that Paul Bunyan bar. Damn, I wish that would have happened. A huge thank you to everyone for tuning in, and an extra special shout out to my magic Brickey holders. Your support makes this show possible every week, and I appreciate you for it. Friends, I'll see you back here next week, same time, same channel, just 70 years late.